clearly from the last presentation that we gave, there's a clear need for governance for carbon removal. And in the next set of slides, we'll be going through 9 key governance challenges that we've identified through our work. And then we'll look at 6 priorities that we might consider addressing in the near term to fill these gaps. But first, let's just take a step back. What does it really look like to govern large-scale CDR effectively? Well, first of all, we'd want to actually reduce the amount of carbon removal that we need to a more manageable level, noting that it's really not this magic bullet. Then we need to identify what risks there are so that we could effectively mitigate those risks and select an appropriate portfolio of carbon removal options, as well as to identify responsibilities for deploying carbon removal and ensuring its safety. And then once we've done those things, we could think about how to actually scale up carbon dioxide removal options that we think are viable in a way that is both fast and safe. The 9 challenges that we've identified, we consider to be kind of blockages in these 3 steps. So first of all, I guess a really big overarching challenge is the scale of the mitigation gap that we currently face if we want to limit warming to 1.5. And this has really big implications for how much CDR we're likely to need in the long term to avoid the worst impacts of climate change. Really, the most important thing to do is to reduce the amount of carbon removal that we need. And the best way of doing that is to get our near-term emissions down. And that means we can't just rely on incremental improvements in government ambition levels in the pledges and the nationally determined contributions, but we really need transformational change. And we actually did some recent work looking into this link between near-term ambition and longer-term carbon removal needs and burdens for future generations. We looked at how the burden of carbon removal could be shared between countries using different ways of viewing responsibility. So either responsibility for causing climate change or responsibility reflected by how much capacity different countries have for potentially deploying carbon removal. And in this analysis, we found that it's really the biggest emitters. So for example, China, the EU, and the US that would take up a big portion of the CDR burden. And we actually found that for each additional gigaton of emissions released in 2030, we'd then get an additional 20 to 70 gigatons of carbon removal burden over the course of the century. So you can see this really important relationship between longer term removal needs and near-term emissions levels. It follows that the current pledges and the nationally determined contributions would actually leave a really big burden of carbon removal for future generations, so more than 100 gigatons for each of China, the US, and the EU. So we then looked at what would happen if those major emitters were to double their near-term mitigation ambition. So what if they were to reduce their emissions levels in 2030 by half, which is roughly consistent with what is required at the global level to limit warming to 1.5. And we found that this would drastically reduce the fair share burdens of each of these countries. So equivalent to, up to about 420 billion tons for China, up to 250 billion tons for the US, and 120 billion tons for the EU. And to understand what those kind of mean, that's equivalent to about 40 years worth of China's current CO2 emissions for China, 50 years worth for the US, and 30 years worth for the EU. So these are really big numbers that we're talking about. So once we've done all that we can to minimize the amount of carbon removal that we need, we then need to be able to track its use. So that's our next governance challenge, is understanding where we are at and where we're heading. For understanding where we're at, we really need reliable emissions inventories. And that's a big challenge at the moment where we have a lot of data gaps, particularly amongst developing countries. And I'll mention that more in the next slide. But also there's the structure of the inventory reports that are currently used by parties present a challenge because they don't currently allow a sufficient level of detail for determining which types of carbon removal are being used by different countries. So it's hard to see, for example, the contribution of BECCS, of DACCS and other CDR options to negative emissions. And also it's hard to see the total gross flows of emissions and removals because often these inventory reports and the summary tables, they aggregate everything and just give you a net flow. So that makes it much more difficult to see how many removals have been achieved and how many emissions a country still has to reduce before they could get close to net zero. Then we need to understand where we're heading, so where the current pledges put forward by governments are taking us. And this means we really need clarity on what government pledges will deliver. But at the moment, as we discussed in our previous presentation, the NDCs don't contain a clear set of targets, in particular for the land sector, which is really important for land-based removals. The land sector targets that are currently put forward are not distinct from, for example, targets for emissions from fossil fuels. Our next challenge is also related to tracking progress. This is more about information gaps. So we face challenges in actually monitoring what our removals and emissions are doing. And this is a particular problem for the land sector where uncertainties are very high. And they also vary greatly between countries, with developing countries facing much larger challenges in reducing the uncertainties. And this is relevant both for the land-based options, so afforestation and reforestation, and soil carbon sequestration, but also for bioenergy. And we know that the total life cycle effects of a bioenergy project really depends on the context in which it's deployed and the time frame over which you're looking at or over which you're examining the project. And so these are really big challenges for understanding what even an individual project might mean for achieving negative emissions. And then we also have a challenge that a number of countries differ in how they differentiate between what emissions and removals are truly anthropogenic versus what are non-anthropogenic. At the moment, there's a proxy that the IPCC guidelines state that countries should use, but this, of course, is only a proxy, and so we actually have differences in how that's used, and this leads to challenges in really understanding what man-made removals and man-made emissions look like. We then have challenges in not only monitoring the emissions and removals themselves, but also in understanding the biophysical effects of deploying a carbon removal option. So a lot of options, particularly the land-based options, can affect, for example, the albedo of the Earth, so that can lead to local warming at higher latitudes. But they can also affect water and heat fluxes. So just by planting a forest, you can change the local water cycle, for example. At the moment, there's a limited understanding of the net biophysical effect of what a large-scale carbon dioxide removal initiative could produce, for example, a large-scale reforestation campaign. And we also don't really understand what the consequences are at the local level. So for climate change, just in an area just downwind of where that project is being implemented. And now I'll pass over to MJ to go through the rest of the challenges and to also highlight some priorities.
Thank you, Claire. We've got another 5 challenges before we turn to some priority actions to address these challenges. But a key challenge is ensuring durable removals, ensuring that the CO2, once removed, stays removed. Permanence it's a big issue for terrestrial sinks, which have a high risk of reversal over time, either through land management decisions or through natural disturbances such as wildfires or infestation, for example. And then there are also feedback loops. Geological storage has lower risks of seepage, for example, but risks nonetheless that need to be taken into consideration. Leakage is also a challenge. For example, a reduction in deforestation in one area can lead to deforestation in another area, undermining the benefits of for example, an afforestation and reforestation project undertaken. Saturation is another concern. Once a biological system's reached a state of near equilibrium, it won't be able to continue to remove carbon. So that also is a feature that needs to be considered in siting, for example, CDR options. So each of these elements provides challenges for planning and for reporting and for accounting in particular. The next governance challenge is ensuring that there are safeguards in place for sustainable development. It's very clear that both negative and positive impacts of CDR deployment will be determined by the scale, the context, implementation strategy of CDR deployment. The technical potential that's been identified for some CDR options simply isn't achievable once sustainable development concerns have been factored in. So it's important to understand the sustainable development challenges and context in a given location before planning and deployment really takes place. For example, there are potential risks for food production, for biodiversity, and for social cohesion, where large-scale afforestation or where BECCS, for example, is considered. portfolios of options that are suited to local contexts are needed, with safeguards for sustainable development in place. Another challenge is actually the responsibility and ethics of implementation. To date, in the climate change regime, there hasn't been a discussion or a clear assignment, certainly, or acknowledgement of responsibility for carbon dioxide removal. And at the same time, there are huge equity and intergenerational equity concerns that come from both the quantum and the pace of CDR. There are studies now that highlight criteria that might be used for such an assignment of responsibility, such as contribution to cumulative emissions and capacity to pay. And Claire, my colleagues, actually produced quite a good paper on this that I recommend for your reading pleasure. Another challenge we have is, of course, the design of incentives to support the rapid scaling up of CDR to the scale needed to limit warming to 1.5. Some of the challenges are that certain CDR options are expensive. DACCS, for example, is expensive. Some CDR options involve multiple players. BECCS and DACCS are examples. And some present substantial monitoring and accounting challenges. We also need to, in designing CDR incentives, consider which players are involved, what impacts and trade-offs with, for example, food security and biodiversity and water supply, et cetera, are possible. And also the accounting implications of different incentive structures. It's also very clear that poorly designed incentives can lead to not just poor outcomes for the climate, but also for local communities and local ecosystems and local economies. A ninth challenge is public awareness and acceptability. In general, there's a fairly limited understanding of the imperative for CDR and for the scale of the mitigation that's needed to lessen dependence on CDR options to actually stay within the 1.5 degree limit. So in addition to a sort of a lack of understanding of options themselves, there's kind of a lack of understanding of the need for and the scale that might be needed of CDR options in the future. There's also a limited awareness of local co-benefits of some options. So for example, afforestation and reforestation can have very substantial local co-benefits, as can ecosystem restoration. There's just a very interesting paper that's been produced in the last week that came from the UK Climate Assembly. They convened a representative cross-section of the UK population to consider, among other things, carbon dioxide removal options in the context of how the UK plans to achieve or might plan to achieve its net zero target. And interestingly, the members, when they came together, were much less supportive of BECCS and DACCS, for example, than for afforestation and reforestation. In fact, what's quite interesting to note is that 40% thought that we really do need to use BECCS and DACCS. Another 40%, roughly 40%, were quite against the use of BECCS and DACCS. So it's clear that there's some need for more public information so that these issues can be debated with their full contexts understood. In the next slide, we have basically just put together a summary of these key governance gaps and challenges for CDR at scale. And I won't walk you through them again, but just to flag that the key overarching challenge really is the pace and the scale of the CDR that's required if mitigation ambition isn't rapidly increased. Because if we don't see a rapid increase in mitigation ambition, the scale of CDR needed is going to be quite vast. And that presents a whole raft, a whole cascading sequence of challenges that just grow and grow. Against that backdrop, priority actions. What are the near-term priority actions that need to be undertaken to put governance systems in place for CDR? But the first is an urgent raising of ambition to narrow the 2030 mitigation gap by enhancing NDCs and putting domestic policy initiatives in place to get emissions on a 1.5 degree consistent pathway. The greater the near-term ambition, the lower the amount of CDR that's needed. And we need to get the amount of CDR needed down to a manageable level. A motivator for raising ambition is basically understanding the burden that we'll be left with if we don't pick up the pace for emission reductions. The second priority, in our view, it will be very important to develop distinct targets for emission reductions on the one hand and for removals on the other. It'll also be helpful for countries to have very clear land sector targets. In this way, it'll be clear that the land sector reductions, that they aren't being used just to postpone reductions in fossil fuel emissions, but instead that removals are being used to complement the necessary emission reductions in other sectors. As more countries, of course, announce net zero goals, it's also going to be very important to have a common understanding across countries of what a long-term net zero target means. And in our view, a domestic net zero goal should be understood to include all sectors, all greenhouse gases, and no reliance on international offsets. In addition to clear targets, a priority is getting in place improved data collection and monitoring systems so that we can track progress toward these targets. This requires improved monitoring systems and inventory data, capacity building for developing countries, and accounting systems that address the risk of reversals. A third priority is putting in place robust accounting for international transfers. Market-based cooperative approaches under the Paris Agreement should really be reserved for reductions that are clearly permanent, clearly additional, readily measurable, and verifiable. This means that land sector CDR offsets would not really check all of these boxes as they're not permanent or readily measurable or verifiable. So definite challenges against these criteria. A fourth priority is creating incentives for the scaling up and deployment of CDR options using, we would say, results-based finance for land-based CDR options, putting in place policy packages for CDR options that are more mature and that don't pose risks to sustainable development, and then also putting in place risk-sharing efforts to support research and development. Fifth of sixth is priority would be to undertake further research on how best to scale up various CDR options while simultaneously protecting and safeguarding sustainable development. This means research that identifies portfolios of CDR options that might be likely to work within specific local, cultural, and economic contexts in view of the challenges that large-scale CDR can pose. To the extent CDR options are being deployed, systems that can publicly track these initiatives and identify their successes or challenges will be really, really important. Sixth, it'll be essential to improve public awareness of CDR options and trade-offs, and I think this point's been made more than once. This will require engaging a wide range of stakeholders in planning and in improving collaboration and cooperation. So not just among various groups of stakeholders, but also across treaty processes and even across academic disciplines to ensure that the implications of CDR options are thoroughly considered before implementation and wider deployment takes place. So then finally, a nice summary slide that brings together some of what we've identified as priority options. Hopefully what you've taken from this presentation is that we have a climate change regime in place. It has a set of decisions upon which we can build for CDR governance at the international level. But that having been said, there are big gaps that remain. Given the need for rapid scaling up of CDR, and with net zero goals becoming a big topic for discussion, we clearly have some gaps that we urgently need to address if we're going to be able to actually achieve removals at the scale and the pace that's needed. This will require, as we know, substantial lead time, substantial planning, and substantial resources. It will also require governance tools to ensure that CDR can be deployed sustainably, and of course, that progress in achieving net zero and ultimately, net negative emissions can be monitored effectively. We do go into each of these elements in much more detail in our recently updated paper on large-scale CDR governance. Are we ready? And we're quite happy to answer any questions you might have. Thank you very much.